I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is a Fear and Greed extended interview. All the other good bits we couldn't fit into the daily podcast. If you're looking for the daily episode of Fear and Greed, check the podcast playlist. Otherwise, enjoy the interview. I've spoken many times on Fear and Greed about cyber security because it's difficult to overstate just how critical it is. The threat from cybersecurity will be one of the main issues governments, institutions, businesses and individuals will be forced to confront well into the future as more of our lives move online. And this year, health could be the big target, with cyber criminals expected to target the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine, according to the 2021 CrowdStrike Global Threat Report. Michael Sentonas is the Chief Technology Officer at CrowdStrike. Michael, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Thanks for having me.
First, let's look at your findings in relation to health and the COVID-19 vaccine rollout. Why do you think that area will be targeted?
Look, I think there's a few different reasons. One is targeting the sector itself, because you've got a group that are so critical to everything that we do at the moment, and targeting healthcare organisations with things like ransomware. I guess the people behind it know that they're going to get somebody paying up a ransom pretty quickly. They're going to want to get their businesses up and running. We've seen over 100 healthcare organisations targeted by ransomware in 2020. And I think we should expect that targeting will continue throughout this year.
In a practical sense, how does that work? Can you give me an example?
Well, ransomware today, it's all about extracting the maximum amount of money you can. And I know that sounds a little bit funny, but it's important to kind of call that out. I mean, ransomware has always been traditionally about encrypting people's data and then saying, give me a few $100s to get it back. Now what we're seeing is people asking, give me a few $1 million to get it back. And that's evolved even more, where adversaries are trying to find ways to ask for different types of ransom. I'm going to encrypt your data, give me a few $1 million to get it back, and also give me another $1 million for me to not sell it or leak it onto a number of different sites. So it's become very complex, and it's all about extracting the maximum amount of money you can from the targeted organisation.
So in these sorts of instances around health, is it less likely to be a state actor and more likely to be a criminal cartel?
No, unfortunately, they do bleed over. So traditionally, it was pretty straightforward. You knew what a nation state would be doing. You knew what an e-crime actor would be doing, but they do bleed over. There's examples of nation states that are trying to generate income. They're trying to find money. So they will carry out e-crime attacks. And there's also operations where you do see the bleed over to make it a little bit harder to follow. So it adds to the complexity in this space, that's for sure.
Will some of the major states be less likely to attack? And I suppose I'm thinking China and Russia here, in that area.
In a lot of cases, yeah, absolutely. But we also know throughout 2020, DPRK adversaries were focusing on obtaining capital.
So DPRK is North Korea?
It is.
Yep.
And we know that they were focusing on obtaining capital through e-crime tactics like ransomware, extortion, and targeting of cryptocurrency exchanges. So it's not to say that the norms, we can say, okay, these countries are only going to do these things. So that's what adds to the complexity.
It just seems that supply chains are the most vulnerable area of cyber attack. Is that right?
Not necessarily the most vulnerable, but supply chain attacks continue because the threat that they create, supply chain attacks represent a unique initial access tactic. So we see this time and time again where the adversary, if they target a supply chain, in most cases software supply chain, it gives them the ability to propagate from a single intrusion to multiple targets of interest, and they can do it very quickly at scale. It's not easy to do, but when you do it and you do it successfully, you can see the impact is immense.
The report this year includes a term that I had never heard of, to be honest. It refers to the extortion of data, dedicated leak sites, DLS. What's that one?
Yeah, that goes back to that concept of, probably easier to understand if you say double extortion. So ransomware attacks, it's all about extorting the victim, the target. The whole concept of using data leak sites is essentially to accelerate that data extortion technique. And that goes back to saying, either pay me double, so A, I can give you your data back, and B, I'm not going to sell it or leak it. Or in some cases, it's to put additional pressure to force people to pay up very, very quickly. And we see, interesting things where adversaries will say, here's a payment plan. You've got X number of days to pay us, and this is what you have to pay us. And the longer you take to pay us, the higher that request is going to become.
It's pretty insidious.
It's crazy. I've been doing this for a while, and I think every year I say, well, last year was the worst we've ever seen, but the last 6 months in this space has been incredible.
Michael, stay with me. We'll be back in a second. My guest today is Chief Technology Officer of CrowdStrike, Michael Sentonas. The report talks specifically about some countries posing the biggest threat. You mentioned North Korea a moment ago. China, Iran, Russia, they're all mentioned in the report. Are attacks from these countries targeting anything in particular? So we're moving off health a little bit. Is it data that they want? Is it intelligence, sort of sovereign intelligence that they want? Is it very different to what cyber criminals are actually after?
Yeah, it is different. Behind every attack, I think it's important for people to understand behind every attack is a person, and they're motivated by different things. We talked about North Korea earlier, focusing on obtaining capital through a number of different e-crime tactics. But then you talk about China as an example. They're going to focus on targeting specific industries, academic, healthcare, technology, manufacturing, aerospace. We know China as an example will most likely be carrying out targeting in support of the 14th five-year plan. And then Russian adversaries, again, may be focused on different things, whether it's defense information or otherwise. When you understand those techniques, the tradecraft, the procedures, and what motivates these attackers, it helps you understand how to protect yourself and what you need to be thinking about. So that's one of the reasons why we go into so much detail about who the adversaries are, what they're trying to do, and what you need to be thinking about to protect yourself.
So if you take the 14th five-year plan as an example, what you mean is that China has a 5-year plan, which it's just ratified in the last couple of weeks. It will want intelligence on those areas that are in the plan, either competitive intelligence, either new ways of doing things. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. Spot on.
Righto. How big a threat is Russia?
Well, like all nation states, they've got, in this particular space, I should say, they've got the capability, they've certainly got the intent and the history of carrying out attacks. So, we could talk about that for hours, but they certainly are a huge concern, and they're some of the most capable. We typically track how long it takes adversaries to carry out an attack. So when they're trying to find a beachhead and they're trying to enter an organization and then to start to move laterally to carry out an attack, Russia continues to be, or groups affiliated with Russia is probably the better thing I should say. They're always up there at the top of the list.
It's funny, whenever I talk about cyber crime, I struggle getting my head around kind of the tangible nature of it. I get it at the end user stage, so at my stage, but is it literally engineering scientists or coders sitting down, being sponsored, as in being paid money by the state or by criminal gangs, to create software to crack commercial software or sovereign software? It's literally trawling through software to try and find breaches. Is that the nuts and bolts of it?
Look, that's one example, but there's so many different ways that a lot of these attacks can manifest themselves, and a lot of different ways that they can be carried out. There's groups that are focused on building the actual malicious software. So if I use the example of ransomware, there are groups that build the ransomware and then they lease it out, and they provide a service to people to be able to use. So if you want to make money and you don't have the skills to be able to build that malicious software, you can rent it, and somebody's got a payment plan and you pay them for their IP and you share in the profits. They are criminal groups. Some of these criminal groups also use the tools themselves. They build their own versions, all the way through to there's groups that are carrying out nation-state attacking groups that are focused purely on getting into a specific network, a specific bit of software. They're well-resourced, they're well-funded and trained, and they've got time, and eventually they're going to find a way in. So that's what makes this complex, because it can, when we talk about cyber attacks, they can mean many different things. It could be a denial of service. So somebody's targeting service availability. When we're all trying to get into and this is just an example, if we're all trying to get in and register to get a vaccine, well, if that vaccine platform is suddenly not available, that's a problem. And you can look at so many examples, even here in Australia, of denial of service, stock exchanges being taken offline. So there's so many different ways that these attacks can happen.
Yeah. In the report, it talks about aerospace. And when you think about aerospace, that's a scary thought when it comes to cybercrime. But what's the vulnerability in aerospace?
Well, in that particular example there, I mean, there's so much focus on stealing intellectual property. You know, it's a race. It's a lot of organizations focusing on developing their intellectual property, and there's people that want to get access to it. A slightly different example, which I think is really interesting to talk about, is the attacks that we saw in the last 12 months that were focused around COVID-19 research. There are countries that had incredible response to COVID-19, and they did that through, let's call it, borrowing of research from whether it's pharmaceuticals or other countries. And this is just, again, another example of the way this world works.
As you said earlier, it seems to get worse and worse every year. Now, organisations like CrowdStrike, your role in life is to help people prevent this to some extent. Is there much of a government collaboration, I suppose, around the world to try and do something about it? Or is it that there are so many rogue state nations that's a difficult thing to implement?
Yeah, look, there is absolutely government collaboration. And I think this is an area that it's important to tread carefully a little bit, because it's really easy to say the government should be doing more, and we can all sort of bang on about that. But governments around the world are very focused on this, and we see this here in Australia, we see it abroad. George, our CEO, testified at a US Senate committee, and there was a number of different people from different organizations offering expert testimony around what's happening and what we should be doing. I think we can all agree we can be doing more, but we are focused on collaborative initiatives. We are focused on sharing intelligence, and we just got to keep bashing away at it. I don't think it's a problem that's going to go away anytime soon. We know that we can throw so much more resource at it, and we don't have enough. But I think it's always been that way. So we just got to keep focused on it.
Michael, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks for your time.
That was Michael Sentonas, Chief Technology Officer of CrowdStrike.